Okay, let's get started with our reading session today. First thing we're going to do is just talk about, in general, kind of an overview of the reading test, maybe some strategies that you can use, and then we're going to work through each of the practice passages that I've given you in the practice test. So it goes literary narrative, social sciences, humanities, and then natural science. So let's spend just a moment talking about how the test is formatted and what you can anticipate. So you have 4 passages on every ACT reading test. That never is going to change. The order of those passages also will never change. You will have 10 questions per passage. That will never change. So it's a total of 40 questions. It means you have 35 minutes to do the entire test. So 35 minutes for 40 questions. Obviously, time is going to be of the essence. So it roughly figures to 8.5 minutes per passage. So as you do practice items, you need to train yourself. Can I do this in 8.5 or fewer minutes? If that's not feasible for you, one strategy I'll tell you right off the bat is you can do 3 passages very carefully, and that gives you about 12 minutes per passage. And then you do what we call burning, the 4th passage, where you just guess consistently the first answer. If you guess consistently on those 10 answers, then you're going to get maybe 1 out of 4 correct. And so that could get you to a benchmark score. It's probably not going to get you to a competitive score, but it is a strategy that can help you if you are below benchmark. In order to get to benchmark, that is a score of 20 if you look at the scale score for this practice test. And by the way, every test has a different number of questions that you have to get. It may vary by 1 or 2 questions, but on this particular test we're using today, you have to answer at least 23 out of the 40 correctly in order to be at benchmark, which is a 20 scale score. So 8.5 minutes per passage, that's where you're going to have to really work on developing some skill as a reader. And I'm going to give you some tips for that today. The passages are always in this order: literary narrative, social science, humanities, and the natural science. Literary narrative is going to be, as its name suggests, a narrative. It's going to chronologically usually tell you some sort of story. It can be fiction or nonfiction. It may develop characters, may develop plot, but you're going to have to use a lot of inference-making skills to answer the questions in literary narrative. Social science is going to be something about the topic of sociology, psychology, history, geography, any of the social sciences for that passage. It's always going to be nonfiction. Passage 3 is humanities. It may be about art, theater, religion, dance. And then passage 4, natural science, is going to be about medicine, genetics, chemistry, biology, one of the pure sciences. So here's another strategy that you can use. If you've taken enough practice tests and you know that passage 2 is your weakest passage, for example, say you only answer an average of 4 out of 10 correctly on passage 2, save that for the last passage. If you know that passage 3, humanities, is your strongest passage and you typically answer 8 out of 10 correctly, start with passage 3. So start with your strongest passage type, work your way through the test to your weakest, and that way if you run out of time, you run out of time on the portion that you probably wouldn't have answered very many correctly anyway. And so if you have to use that burn strategy of just making a random guess, then you could do that on the weakest passage. What we would rather get you to is to an educated guess instead of just a random sort of guess. The reporting categories for reading divides question types into 3 categories: key ideas and details, craft and structure, and integration of knowledge and ideas. On this particular test that you're taking today, 23 questions are called key ideas and details. So those will be questions that say, in the passage, the author most nearly means, or as stated in the passage, this detail. So it's either going to be something directly stated or something implied. 23 questions out of 40, so that's the most frequent type of question on reading. Craft and structure is going to be about placement of ideas, about transitions, about where the main ideas are supported, and there are 12 questions out of 40, so you see significantly fewer questions in that category. And on today's practice test, there are only 5 integration of knowledge and ideas questions. So those are questions that ask you to synthesize information from different parts of the passage. So very few questions fall into that category. So in terms of strategy, we're going to practice a strategy with the first passage, passage 1. And if you will open up to the practice test, the one that's labeled B05, and it's a December test. And passage 1 is literary narrative. Now, there are a couple of things that I always recommend you do that's not going to cost you a lot of time, but it can give you an advantage. Always read the blurb at the top of the passage. So we know that it's going to be literary narrative. We know what the directions say. We don't have to read the directions and spend any time there. But I would read the little blurb at the top. This tells you that it's a passage adapted from the book Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall. It was published in 2013. Automatically, I already know a few things about the passage. It sets a purpose for my reading. I know that I'm going to be talking about plants and indigenous people. And so I go into it with a framework or a context for reading. Now, here's the strategy I want us to use on this passage. Notice that we can clearly see the paragraph division. So here's paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, and so forth. This fits pretty much on one page. There's one paragraph that's on page 2 of the test. But this first strategy I want you to use is called hashtagging. When you read a paragraph, I want you to provide a 1 or 2 word hashtag for that paragraph. Let me model that for you so you know what I'm talking about. A hashtag would be like 1 or 2 key words that you would use to indicate this is the main idea of the paragraph. So here's paragraph 1. Even now, after more than 50 strawberry moons, finding a patch of wild strawberries still touches me with a sensation of surprise, a feeling of unworthiness and gratitude for the generosity and kindness that comes with an unexpected gift all wrapped in red and green. Really? For me? Oh, you shouldn't have. After 50 years, they still raise the question of how to respond to their generosity. Sometimes it feels like a silly question with a very simple answer: eat them. So if we had to come up with a 1 or 2 word hashtag for this paragraph, it's just something to help you remember what details were included in that paragraph. For example, you might do hashtag 50. Because the author tells you that this has been going on for 50 years and the author still has a sense of wonder and appreciation when she receives the gift. The gift she's talking about here is strawberries. So you could do hashtag strawberries on that paragraph. And again, it's just a quick little way to help you remember what it is that you've read in that passage or in that paragraph. There are 2 camps of thought on how to approach questions. So one camp of thought is read the questions first, then read the passage. The other camp of thought is read the passage, then go to the questions. Both of those strategies have merits. I have a definite preference, and I'll tell you what my preference is because it works for me, and I'll tell you why it works for me. I read the passage first, I hashtag the paragraphs, and then I go to the questions. My process of reading is I read to determine the author's overall attitude toward the subject. So if I read this passage about indigenous people, about strawberries, about plants, and I see that the narrator is very favorable about the subject, then that's going to help me pick the best answer. So if I read a question and one of the answer choices is a really negative attitude toward the subject, but the whole passage has been very favorable and very positive, I know that the negative choice is not the right answer. So for me, it's more about getting a general impression. Is this positive? Is it negative? And then applying that to the individual questions. That's what works for me. For other people, they like to read with a purpose of I'm looking for the answer. So they go to the question and they find specific words and questions that are going to be signals for them, and they're going to underline when they get to that portion in the test booklet. Whichever method works for you, go for it. But you've got to figure out which is your preferred method. As far as writing in the book, there's nothing in ACT regulations that says you cannot write in the book. You cannot have a highlighter with you. You can only have a number 2 pencil. But you can certainly take that number two pencil and mark up and annotate the passages as you read. I also advocate that if you're using the strategy of starting with passage 3, for example, that's question number 30. It's terrible if you start on question 30, but you bubble your answer for question number 30 on number 1. And then you get to number 40 and you realize that you've messed up your bubbling on the answer sheet. So what you might want to do is just circle your answers in the test booklet. And when you have about 2 minutes remaining, just go in and feverishly bubble in your answers on the answer grid so that you don't get offline with your answering. Okay? So here's what I would like for you to do. I'm going to set my timer for 8.5 minutes. I'd like for you to read passage 1 and hashtag each paragraph and then answer the 10 questions. So 8.5 minutes so you can feel kind of the pressure of the time and what that feels like beginning now.
the questions, please?
Yeah, so that 8.5 minutes is to read the passage, answer the questions. Stop. That's 8.5 minutes, so that's how much time you have on the actual test to complete a passage. So I want to show you what my passage looks like. You can see that I have done the hashtagging on the side of each paragraph. I've underlined things. I've circled things. So that's the process that I want you to use when you read. Read actively, annotate, and this is going to help you get a better score. Now let's look at the questions. Here's what I want to do. I want to look at the questions by type. Circle these questions with me. Number 1, number 3, number 6, and 7. So 1, 3, 6, and 7. Those 4 questions all have something in common. They are the craft and structure questions. So craft and structure questions are going to ask you about the point of view. They're going to ask you about the main purpose or why an author might include it, for example, a quotation. And it's going to ask you questions about diction. Diction is word choice. As it is used in line 9, the word blank most nearly means blank. So those types of questions are going to be craft and structure. So let's look at the answers to those 4 questions. Number 1, the point of view from which the passage is told can best be described as that of a, before you answer the question, let's think about point of view. There are 3 types of point of view. There's first person, second person, and third person. First person pronoun, what are you going to expect to see? I. So I is going to be the main pronoun in first person. What about third person? What's the main pronouns? He, she, it. What's the second person pronoun? You. So you is second person. Notice that second person isn't even an option, and it probably will never be an option because good writers do not use second person point of view. It's very rare that you'll find a piece of nonfiction or fiction that's written in second person. So if you look at your choices, you've got two choices that say first person, two that say third. You go back and you look at the first paragraph, and you see that, or actually the second paragraph, line 10, the pronoun used is I. So it's got to be first person point of view. So that narrows it to A or B. So then you have to look at the description of the narrator. So is it a narrator describing the experience of picking strawberries as it happens? Or is it about events from the past that influence her belief about gifts? The best answer there is B. So number one, you should have marked B. So this whole passage then is about more than just wild strawberries. It's about that idea of connecting wild strawberries to gifts. That gifts are something that come to you unexpectedly and unasked for, but they fill the narrator with such gratitude. So that's the whole point of this. And so as you read the passage, you should have gotten that, and you should have gotten it as a very favorable sort of tone or attitude toward that subject. Okay, drop down to number 3, another craft and structure question. The main purpose of the second paragraph is to, if you go back and look at that paragraph, my hashtag beside paragraph number 2 is family. And so I know that this answer's got to do something with family, and C is the best answer. Provide a cultural context for the significance of strawberries to the narrator's family. So there's how a hashtag beside a paragraph helped me find the right answer. Move over to question number 6, another craft and structure question. The quotation in line 6 is most likely included too. This is the line where she imagines the strawberries gifting themselves to her, and she says, really? For me? And so it indicates there, that rhetorical question indicates her surprise. So G is the best answer, surprise and gratitude. And then number 7, as it is used in line 20, the word recognize most nearly means. So if you go back and it says, we recognize them, the strawberry, as the leaders of the berries, the first to bear fruit. So that recognize means we acknowledge them. D. Now, the remainder, number 3 was C. The cultural context about the narrator's family. Every other question in passage 1 is a key idea and detail question. That means that the answer is either directly stated in the text, and we can find a line reference for it, or you have to make an inference based on something that is directly stated. So let's look at question number 2. Based on the passage, the word they in line 7 refers to. Now here's the thing. They, after 50 years, they still raise the question of how to respond to their generosity. The only subjects introduced in paragraph 1 are the narrator and the strawberries. And she's talking about the strawberries gifting themselves. So the best answer is H, wild strawberries. That's the antecedent of the pronoun they. Number 4, based on the passage, which action was part of the narrator's attempt to give back to the strawberries? And if you go and look at line 75, because it gives you a direct line reference there, and you look at line 75, it says, I was fascinated by the way they would travel the ground, looking to places take root. I would weed out little patches of bare ground where the runners touched down. So that's her gift to them. G, she weeded out patches of ground. 5 is not directly stated. It's an inference question. So it says it can reasonably be inferred that the narrator learned about the growth cycle of strawberries by A, observing runners and roots of the plants. Number 8, the narrator states that as a child, she experienced her world as. If you go back and read line 37 and 38, it says this: I experienced the world in that time as a gift economy, goods and services not purchased, but received as gifts. So that is choice F, a gift economy. Number 9 is answered in line 59. Picking the strawberries for their father's shortcake took the narrator and her siblings a long time because. Line 59 says, More berries ended up in our mouths. So A, they kept eating the strawberries they picked. Now here's the thing that's a little bit tricky about the reading portion of the ACT and the part that will drive a lot of students crazy. The wording in the passage says, more berries ended up in our mouths. So the student who likes for everything to be neat and boxed and packaged would love to see an answer choice that said, more berries ended up in their mouth. But it doesn't say that. It states it in different words. They kept eating the strawberries they picked. So if you're that type of student that expects what it says here is what it's going to say in the answer, that's what makes this challenging. You have to process and comprehend the information and change it in terms of its language. And then number 10, according to the passage, that means it's directly stated, runners appeared on berry plants in the field when, if you look at line 74, it says, when the berry season was done. So H, again, it's not the same language. It says berry season was over. Okay? So those are the 10 questions for literary narrative. So this literary narrative was actually a personal essay. So it's a personal essay by an author reflecting on past childhood experiences and connecting it to the idea of gifts. Okay, passage 2. Passage 2 is a social science passage. And let's use the same strategy that we used earlier. Very first thing you want to do is look at the blurb at the top. It sets the context for the reading. It's adapted from The Airplane, How Ideas Gave Us Wings. So we know automatically that we're going to be reading something historical. We're going to be reading something about the airplane and about wings. Again, this is a one-pager. Most of the passages that you read on the ACT are going to fit neatly onto one page. And I would recommend that you read this the same way by hashtagging each of the paragraphs. Before we begin reading the passage, let's try the strategy of reading the questions first very quickly. We know that we're going to have a question about the author's claim about the impact of paradigms on success, and that's a craft and structure question because it's asking us about that detail. The passage can be described as, is it a critique, an overview, an explanation, or an analysis? So as I read, I want to think about which of those best describes it. Main idea of the fourth paragraph, I might go back and star the fourth paragraph. Main idea of the seventh paragraph, I might go back and star the seventh paragraph. The author most likely includes the examples of Santos Dumont's flights in 1906. I might write the year 1906 at the top of the passage so that when I come across it, I'm going to circle it. According to the passage, compared to Europe's early experimenters, the Wrights were less inspired by Henson's views because they were. So on the top of my passage, I might write the word Henson because I want to look for what Henson's views were. Line 90, I might go ahead and mark line 90 because I want to look for a word there. The idea that human flight was invented when the Montgolfiers successfully launched their hot air balloons reflects the perspective of. So I know I'm going to have to know about the author, about the Wrights, about the Hensons, and now the French. So I'm reading with a purpose to find out what they all thought about it. I might mark line 19 because I'm going to have to look at sway. And then the passage suggests, compared to early airplanes, horse-drawn vehicles. So I'm going to have to look for that comparison. Okay, so I've employed the strategy of reading the questions first so that I can read with a purpose. I'm going to set the timer for 8.5 minutes, beginning now. Stop. That's the end of your 8.5 minutes for that passage. Okay, so think about this as a representative of passage 2. This is a passage 2 social science because it's about history, aviation history. So passage 2 is always going to be about one of the social sciences: history, geography, politics, government, anything that's a social science. If you had never heard the word paradigm, you could have still answered all these questions correctly because it tells you what a paradigm is in lines 3 and 4. So the whole point of this, you should have gotten, is that sometimes our paradigm, our mindset, can keep us from thinking creatively and innovatively. And so that's what gave the Wright brothers an advantage, is that their paradigm was based on a bicyclist. And a bicyclist is able to tilt and turn into the curves in order to keep the vehicle going. That's called banking. And so when we talk about an airplane banking left, banking right, it's tilting. It's based on that idea of bicycling. The European model, however, was stifled because they had a vision of a fixed wheel carriage, like a horse-drawn carriage. And that mindset prevented them from developing a workable airplane. So that's the whole point of this passage. Now let's talk about the question types. We've got a question type in this passage that we did not have in passage 1. So question number 11 is an integration of knowledge and ideas question. The ACT is tricky. They will give you distractors and that they can anticipate will trip you up, and they will place the most cognitively challenging question as the first question in the question set. So what is likely to happen with question number 11, it's not difficult, I'm not saying that, it's just it requires some time to process the answer. And so you could burn up 2 minutes on question number 11 and then end up running out of time for questions 12 through 20. So question number 11 is an integration of ideas question. If you know that a question is going to eat up a lot of your time, skip it and come back to it later. So don't burn 2 minutes on one question, move on and get the low-hanging fruit, the easy to reach answers, the ones you know you're going to get correct, answer those first. And if you run out of time, guess on a question like number 11, because you're more likely to get it wrong anyway. Which of the following details from the passage best supports the author's claim about the impact of paradigms on success? I just explained to you what the answer is because I explained paradigms and how it impacted the Wright brothers. So B, the Wrights' knowledge of bicycles made banking an airplane seem natural to them. B is the correct answer for number 11. But it took me about 45 seconds to explain that in my own words to get to that answer. So that can eat up a good portion of your time. The rest of the questions, 12 through 20, are your garden variety, key ideas and details, craft and structure questions. So number 12, here are the correct answers. The passage can best be described as, okay, so this is a craft and structure question. You need to know the difference between these types. A critique is when you are giving your opinion about something and supporting it with evidence. So if I critique a restaurant, for example, I'm thinking about how good the service is, how the food is prepared, how it is brought to me, how attentive to detail the server is, and I'm going to make recommendations and I'm going to give my opinion about it. An overview is very broad and general, and I just want to summarize in very general terms without a lot of specifics. I don't get a granular view of anything, but it's just very wide. An explanation is where I give detailed explanations. An explanation might be more granular than an overview. In other words, I get down to brass tacks and I really get in the weeds describing the details. An analysis is where I pick apart something into its component parts and I separate it out and I detail each component and show how they fit together. So this passage, is it a critique with an opinion? Is it an overview that's very general? Is it an explanation that's very specific? Or is it an analysis of picking apart detail by detail and showing how it fits back together? It's an analysis. J is the right answer for 12. 13, main idea of the fourth paragraph. If you look at the fourth paragraph, this answer is not in it. So this is an inference level question. The correct answer is D. So if you go back and look at what it says in paragraph 4 about Henson's steam carriage. It describes the carriage itself, but it's in the next paragraph that you actually find that it motivated experimenters but hindered their ability to invent a successful airplane. Number 14, so be careful of when it said point you to a specific paragraph. You may have to read before and after it to get context. 14, main idea of the 7th paragraph is H, and the key word there is mistakenly fearful of banking. If you look at F, G, and J, the distractors, all of those are relatively positive spins on things, where the narrator here is saying that this paradigm caused a mistake in design. Number 15, when we pre-read the questions, I said mark 1906 when you get to it. So I circled 1906. It's in line 67. And it says the author most likely includes the example of Santos Dumont's flights to A, illustrate how an inaccurate paradigm can impede overall success. So it's being boxed into your preconceived notion. That's what that illustrates. 16, according to the passage, compared to Europe's early experimenters, the Wrights were less inspired by Henson's vision because they were H, accustomed to a different mode of transportation. Notice that the question doesn't mention the word bicycle. If it had, it would have made it a very easy question. But it just says it's a different mode of transportation, bicycling. 17, the phrase stay on top in line 90 doesn't mean literally to stay on top of the bicycle, but it means figuratively to pay attention to, B. If I tell you stay on top of your assignment, it means pay attention. 18, as presented in the passage, the idea that human flight was invented when the Montgolfiers successfully launched their hot air balloons. I circled that word because I had pre-read the question. It's in line 14, and it suggests the perspective of the French, J. 19 is about the word sway. It says that Henson held sway over others. When you use sway that way, it doesn't mean to rock back and forth, but it means to hold influence, B. And then number 20, the passage most strongly suggests that compared to early airplanes, horse-drawn vehicles, and it made the point that a horse-drawn vehicle, you use the reins to get them started, and then it basically, the horses do the work. So F required less continuous steering. All right, and that's passage 2, social sciences. Passage 3, humanities. We go to that passage. And read the blurb at the top. We've got 2 passages, passage A and passage B. A is from a biography about Duke Ellington. B is the biography of Mavis Staples and the Staples Singers and Freedom Highway. So we've got 2 passages here, and obviously we're going to have to do some compare and contrast with these 2 passages. Then we have questions 21 through 30 to deal with. So you'll notice in the questions, 25, 26, and 27 are just about passage B. 21 through 24 are just about passage A. And then the last 2 questions, or 3 questions rather, are about both passages. Okay? You pick the strategy to use on this passage. Use a combination of any of the strategies we've talked about in terms of pre-reading the questions, hashtagging the paragraphs, whatever strategy works for you. You've got 8.5 minutes to work through the humanities passage, beginning now. Stop. That's the end of your 8.5 minutes for that passage. This was very different because you had the two passages. You had to figure out what was going on in both passages, and then you had questions 28, 29, and 30 that were all three integration of knowledge and ideas questions. And again, those are the questions that eat up the most time. So if you see those, you recognize them, they may be some questions you want to burn by just making either a random guess or an educated guess, depending on how much time you have remaining. Okay, so passage A was all about Duke Ellington and about how his style was very eclectic based on his own ear. He never produced really a smooth technical sound, and that drew some criticism from other composers. He used a couple of words I really like in lines 9 and 10. He juxtaposed their idiosyncratic sounds the way a pointillist painter might do. So there's really good level diction in that reading passage. And then in passage B, it talks about the artist who's a little more polished and a little more on point when it comes to singing in a particular key. And the emphasis was on being with the family and being able to harmonize with the family. So that's kind of a general overview. Let's look at correct answers. Passage A, question 21. The phrase smoothly blended playing most nearly describes. Okay, so we know Ellington didn't do that. So it was B, a sound that band leaders Goodman, Shaw, and Lunsford demanded from their musicians. So that is a contrast to Duke Ellington. He didn't produce the smooth sound, but the others did. Okay, question 22, still about passage A. Which statement best expresses Teagardin's opinion of Ellington? And again, he was one of those artists that preferred a smoother sound. J, Teagardin did not like anything about Ellington's band music. He considered it too messy, too all over the place. 23, the author of passage A indicates that Ellington based his decisions about whom to hire to join his band largely on C, his trust in his own ear. It was less technical and more personal. And then 24, one of the main ideas of the second paragraph is G. Ellington elicited from his players performances that tapped their particular musical gifts. And so that's how you ended up with a more eclectic and blended style from Ellington in contrast to the other artists. Question number 25 begins questions about passage B. Here we've got another point of view. Notice second person is not available because that would be very easy to recognize you as second person. So is it first person? Does it use I? No. So we know automatically we've eliminated 50% of the choices. So it has to be third person. So is it a third person narrator who features the experiences and opinions of Pops and Mavis, or is it a third person narrator who expresses opinions of Pops that contrast with those expressed by Mavis? Best answer there is C. He features the experiences and opinions of Pops and Mavis. 26, which of the following statements about Pop's childhood is best supported by passage B? F, he grew up in Mississippi with brothers and sisters who liked to sing together. Now, if you picked choice J, you're in completely the wrong time frame. They're not contemporaries of Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson is mentioned, but that would be decades later. 27, according to passage B, who had the deepest voice in the family? This one's directly stated in lines 63 and 64. It is Mavis. Mavis is chosen for the baritone parts because he had the deepest voice at that time. That's in line 63 and 64. If you had an infinite amount of time, you could go back and find every one of those answers. The fact is, this is a test about your speed to find the details in the passage. Okay, 28, 29, and 30 are the integration of knowledge and ideas questions that burn up a lot of time. So 28, compared to passage A, passage B presents events in an order that is. To me, this one is incredibly difficult because I reasoned back and forth between some of the answers. The correct answer is H, anchored more firmly in one stretch of time. So neither passage is chronological, so that can help you rule out F and G. You might be tempted to say that they are similar, but really H is a better answer because passage B is about the beginning of their band. And so that's why H is the better choice. 29, which the following comparisons between one of the musicians mentioned in passage A and Pops is best supported by the passage. D is the best answer. Like Goodman, Pops valued a sound that was precise. So Goodman and Pops stand in contrast to Ellington. So D is the more accurate statement. And then 30, both passages make use of which the following. It doesn't talk about lyrics from the song, so you can rule out F. It's not professional music critiques or critics, so you can rule out G. And it's not excerpts from memoirs, so that leaves J as the correct answer. It does draw upon, in both passages, quotations from people who observed almost casually the styles of Ellington and of Pops. So those three questions could have burned up a lot of time for you. All right, that brings us to natural science. Now, what I have had in my experience of teaching ACT prep courses is that most students will say passage 4 is their favorite passage. Now, I think there's a reason for that. Passage 4 is going to rely more on answers that are directly stated. Passages 1, 2, and 3 require a lot of inferencing and a lot of integration of knowledge and content and ideas. Passage 4 is a pure science. It's about medicine, genetics, chemistry, biology, botany. All of those tend to have very specific answers. There's not a lot of gray area when it comes to the pure sciences. So if you find this to be the passage that you do best on, even though it's the last, that may be the passage you want to begin with when the proctor says you may begin. So just because question 1 comes first doesn't mean you have to answer question 1 first. You can go to question number 31 and answer it first. All right, I'm going to give you 8.5 minutes. We'll talk about right answers and then we'll be finished. That's the end of your 8.5 minutes. As I said, a lot of students find this to be the easiest passage, but then after reading this one, I don't know if that would be accurate about this particular test. There's a lot of in-depth questions on this one. Okay, so something that we've noticed on these passages today, the first question tends to be a question that can eat up a lot of time. So a strategy that you might want to employ is skip the first question for the passage, answer the rest of the questions, and after you figure out the answers to those questions, you might be better equipped to quickly come up with the answer for number 31 or 21 or 11 or 1, whichever passage you're working on. 31 asks about the main idea of the mesel pit, and the correct answer is C. It contains fossils that reveal how warm-blooded animals evolve. So it's the whole idea of dinosaurs becoming extinct and then mammals evolving as the dominant species. 32, the main purpose of the second paragraph. So if you go look at the second paragraph, it talks about various theories. One theory, another possibility, or perhaps. The correct answer is F, even though it doesn't use the word theory, it says potential explanations. So that's another example where on the reading test, you have to take what it states and make inferences about it, and that may mean changing the language slightly. The rest of them, you can find line references, so I'm going to give you the line references for these answers. Number 33 is found in line 40, and the answer is B, 150. Number 34 is found in lines 59 and 60, and the answer is J, left no descendants. 35 is not exactly directly stated, but if you look around line 70, you can find the answer is C. So around line 70, it explains examples of evolutionary convergence like bushy tails, kangaroo-like hind legs popping up in different species. And so an example that's like that would be different species of birds having similar wings. That's convergence. 36 is found in line 3. It's H, steam erupting from underground. 37 can be found in lines 17 through 19. A, it would have been different if it had contained oxygen circulating near the bottom. So the lack of oxygen is actually what preserved the fossils at the bottom. 38, I don't have a line reference for this one, but the answer is J. They were adaptable. 39 is line 83. C, their stomachs revealed that they had eaten food from grounds of forests, so they were foragers, not grazers. And then 40 is answered in line 85, and the correct answer is J. All right, so hopefully that gives you some tips and some strategies and some good practice that you can use for reading in the ACT. So that's it for today.